French sector of the Rif Mountains, Morocco, 1924. For months, your small outpost has been surrounded by the Rifians. As a French soldier in Morocco, it had been a relatively quiet life, despite the war raging in the Spanish sector. Perhaps you were all naive to imagine that the war wouldn't spread, that thousands of tribesmen wouldn't suddenly descend on the French outposts in the mountains. Now, there are only 7 of you left. The water has run out and food supplies are low. All hopes of rescue have faded away. The final assault by the Rifians is near. You won't go down without a fight, however. Your lieutenant has already created a mine that will blow up the whole outpost when the Berbers overrun it. Bullets smash into the walls of your outpost. One of your comrades clutches his chest and falls to the floor. It is time, you think, as you return fire. You kill many of the charging tribesmen, but there are too many. One gets within reach and leaps at you with a knife. Luckily, you manage to grab his knife hand in time, and you both fall to the floor. As you struggle with the Rifian, you see the lieutenant reaching for the mine. You smile at the tribesman, and a confused expression appears on his face, before all vanishes in a blinding flash of light. I'm your host James Barton, and you're listening to Forgotten Wars.
Consequently, this country is at war with Germany.
Today, our armed forces joined our NATO allies in airstrikes against Serbian forces.
Eagle 1, first strike, you have permission to engage the target.
Just a few hours after our servicemen went to the rescue of young Americans and of democracy in Grenada.
Hello everyone, welcome back to our series on the Rif War, Part 2. The subtitle of this episode, Viva la Muerte, or Viva Death, is the motto of the Tercios, Spain's foreign legion and the best troops it deployed in the war. While rather morbid, it perfectly fits the craziness and bloodshed that engulfs the Rif, as the war enters its most brutal phase. In the last episode, we saw initially overconfident Spain suffering horrific casualties at defeats in the mountains. Spanish society began to fracture over the war, divided between those who wanted to fight on and those who wanted to abandon Morocco. Out of that divide came a military dictatorship as a successful military coup took place. In the Rif Mountains themselves, rebel leader Abd el Krim rules supreme, fighting Spain to a bloody stalemate. Now, we have set our scene. Join me in the mountains of the Rif one last time. First, let's take a look at Spain's newly minted military dictator, General Miguel Primo de Rivera, the second Marquis of Estella. He was a distinguished-looking gentleman with an impressive white moustache. He's been called a moderate dictator by some historians, especially compared to the future Franco regime. Like our old friend General Silvestre in the previous episode, he was also a rampant womanizer. A popular song at the time claimed, "A bottle, some cards, and a beautiful dame mark the coat of arms of our Primo's name." A veteran of previous fighting in the Rif, he knew the area well. However, at this time he was not an Africanista, those who favoured holding on to northern Morocco. In fact, he leaned towards withdrawing from Spain's Moroccan Empire altogether. To help make his final decision, he headed to Morocco to inspect Spain's fortifications and the morale of her soldiers. He received a particularly frosty reception at a Tercio base. There he discovered that his best officers were already muttering about being stabbed in the back by Madrid. They served him nothing but eggs, dish after dish of eggs. It was meant to be something of an insult. In Spain, eggs, in an off-colour metaphor, represented testicles or guts. Effectively, they were telling their dictator they didn't believe he had the cojones to win in Morocco. At a reception in Primo's honour, their leader, and future dictator of Spain himself, Francisco Franco, gave a toast where he proclaimed that the hearts of the soldiers of the Legion were filled with distrust. When Primo rose to speak, he faced an outpouring of boos, insults and catcalls. Ignoring this distinctly hostile reception, he announced that Spain would at a minimum be withdrawing back to the relative safety of the coast. Then looking Franco directly in the eye, in a quiet but stern voice, he said, "And on the day when your orders are given to you, you will have no choice but to obey them, whatever they may be." A humbled Franco offered his resignation, but Primo refused to accept it. He needed men who could fight if he was going to pull off his withdrawal. Franco remained angry, however, and actually proposed kidnapping Primo and imprisoning him in a military jail, before he was talked out of it by his friends. It was an early indication that the best units in the army were increasingly frustrated, angry, and disconnected from the authorities in Madrid. This was only going to grow in strength. The key to Primo's withdrawal strategy was the huge Spanish base at Jeshurun, a holy city to Muslims, housing 10,000 Spanish soldiers. Despite its large garrison, it was constantly under threat of being besieged by the tribesmen. Supplies rarely got through, sniping was constant, and Abd el Krim's forces were always testing its defences. Primo was fearful that he could turn to another disaster, like Anual. Primo himself would personally lead the mission to bring the garrison of Jeshurun to the relative safety of Spain's coastal fortifications. I could not find another occasion in the 20th century where a sitting head of government actually took charge and led a military expedition from the front, especially as this was going to be a hard fight with heavy casualties and every chance of disaster occurring. If anybody else knows of one, please get in contact. I'd love to hear it. Whatever else you can say about Primo, he was certainly brave. While the Spanish force reached Jeshurun relatively easily, that was because Abd el Krim was planning another of his famous traps. He would wait until the Spanish lumbered out with all their sick, wounded, and supplies slowing them down. Then he would attack. From the beginning, it didn't look good for the Spanish. As Primo sent out troops to bring in garrisons of nearby smaller posts, they ran into heavy sniper fire, frequently losing as many men as they were supposed to be saving. Sensing that morale among his men was terrible, Primo was forced to issue a rather unusual order. "It is regrettable that troops should give way at this moment to pessimism, which is destroying the morale of the army. In order to remedy this disgraceful weakness, I order all officers and soldiers to refrain from all criticism or discussion of these questions, and to put immediately under arrest any military subordinate or civilian who may disobey me." On the 15th of November, over 40,000 men began their trek to the stronghold of Tetuan, strung out over narrow gorges and mountain passes. At first, no attacks came. It was quiet, too quiet. Then the moment Abd el Krim had been waiting for arrived. The heavens opened. Torrential rain poured down, bogging down the Spaniards in what seemed to be an endless quagmire of mud. As the Spanish army's progress slowed to a crawl, someone was watching them. Imagine this in your mind's eye. From a perch high up in the mountains, Abd el Krim watches as the large Spanish army snakes its way across the mountain pass. Though hardly old, his face looks as timeless and as ancient as these mountains themselves. A weather-beaten face combined with a white beard and eyes that seem to gleam with intelligence. He's waiting for the perfect moment to attack the Spanish and drive them from the Rif. It will be soon. He can feel the change in the air and see the clouds beginning to form. Soon, the winter rains will come, and the Spanish retreat will slow to a standstill. He turns and speaks to the collection of tribesmen and his top lieutenants waiting behind him. "When the rain falls, we will destroy the Spanish. Their leader, Primo de Rivera, is with them. Whoever brings me his head will become the richest man in the Rif." 7,000 Riffians descended on the Spanish army. Soon the soldiers were fighting every step of the way and taking horrific casualties. At the village of Darkoba, hundreds of Spaniards were killed as tribesmen closed in from both sides of the valley. Worse was to come at the next village of Chiruta. 1,000 men died here, along with the popular General Serrano, their bodies packed together in death. Such was the skill of the tribesmen that one Spanish officer said, half admiringly, "We made war against shadows, and we lost 30 men to their 1. At both Darkoba and Chiruta, incompetence in building fortifications had once again caused disaster. In their haste to construct the posts, they had been built below the surrounding hills. The first attacks on these places were also the last, for the Spaniards were shot at from above as well as from all sides by an enemy they could not even see. They are effectively shooting galleries for the men who took shelter in them. The rest of the army, exhausted, fled into Zoco el Arba and called a halt, for the troops were worn out with constant fighting and the effort of trying to drag the wounded and the cannon and other equipment through mud. For almost 3 weeks they were encircled at Zoco el Arba, praying for better weather and reorganizing for the final dash to the safety of Tetuan. Abd el Krim's rebels hit them relentlessly, day and night, and every soldier, from the officers of the high command down to the lowest recruit, was haunted by the thought that the Zoco might easily turn into another Anual. Keep in mind that Primo was also trapped here with his men as well. It was the biggest target in the whole of the Rif. Let's head there now. You are a Spanish soldier at the Zoco. You have been trapped in this flea-bitten village for 2 weeks, hiding behind your defences, desperately fighting for your life as the Riffians attack day and night. Even the rare quiet moments are not safe. The tribesmen are excellent shots. Their snipers are a shadowy menace, seemingly never sleeping or resting, living only for the kill. Many have fallen victim to these silent assassins. You pull out a battered photo of your family, running your finger over their faces. If it was up to you, the tribesmen could have these cursed mountains they call a home. But it's not up to you. If you don't fight, you will be shot. And if you surrender, the tribesmen will likely do worse to you. Everyone knows the stories of Anual and Monte Route. You hear the now familiar sound of a shell flying through the air, and then it smashes into the Spanish lines. The Riffian rifles and machine guns open up as they launch yet another attack. Raising your rifle, you return fire, seeing a charging tribesman clutching his stomach as he nosedives into the floor. The only way to survive is to hold off these tribesmen until you can make it to the safety of Tetuan. It's fight or die. There is no in between. While thousands of Spaniards had been killed, and the soldiers were terrified of another massacre, the situation was different to before. Panic hadn't broken out, order had been maintained. Also, there were some real acts of heroism as well. The most famous occurred at Guadalajara. 3 Spanish armoured cars stayed behind to cover the army's retreat. Long after the army had disappeared over the horizon, the 14 Spanish soldiers in the now disabled armoured cars fought on against relentless Riffian attacks. They held out for 3 days without food and water, driving back every attack the tribesmen made to storm the armoured cars. On the 3rd day, the tired Riffians dragged cannons to a hill overlooking the armoured cars and shelled them from above. Out of the 14 men who made this epic stand, 10 were killed. The remaining 4, grimy and exhausted Spanish soldiers, surrendered. Now so weak they could not walk and had to be carried by the Riffians. Their bravery had greatly impressed the tribesmen. The company that captured them actually saluted as they were carried past. When El Krim heard of their exploits, he ordered them to be put first on the list of prisoners to be exchanged or ransomed to the Spanish. Breaking out of Zoco, the bedraggled army finally fought its way to Tetuan. A journalist who witnessed the scene wrote that, "Never had I seen soldiers in such a state of exhaustion, dejection, and filth. Primo told his soldiers that, "You are entering Tetuan in triumph. Bravo!" Yet privately he admitted that Abd el Krim has defeated us. He has immense advantages of the terrain and a fanatical following. Our troops are sick of the war, and have been for years. They don't see why they should fight and die for this strip of worthless territory. In abandoning 400 blockhouses and the big base at Chefchaouen, Spain had lost 20,000 men. This included 1 general, 6 lieutenant colonels, 8 majors, and 175 other officers. It was a devastating loss. By comparison, the Riffians had only suffered 800 casualties in total. Yet out of this disaster would emerge a new Spanish army. Primo resolved that major reforms were necessary if the Rif was to be conquered. In a surprisingly candid public statement, he admitted that, "I am every day more convinced that the surprise attacks on the part of the enemy are much less due to his competence than to our own incapacity and negligence. Often the soldiers march in close order, half asleep, their ears covered by the collars of their cloaks, and with their rifles unprepared." First, he built a vast wall of defences and minefields, called the Primo Line, to protect Spain's remaining strongholds on the coast. Then, behind this line, he began to create a better trained, better led, better supplied, and all-around more professional force. The core of this new army would not be the ill-trained conscripts of before. It would be the hard men of the tercios and the native regiments of regulars. While Spain went on the defensive, conspiracy theories were soon spreading about how a European army could possibly be defeated by a mountain tribesman. It was alleged that the Riffians were led by German officers, former servants of Kaiser Wilhelm II, looking for new conquests. While completely false, it was given credibility by the fact that there was actually a German fighting with the Riffians. Joseph Clems was one of those serial rogues and adventurers who always seemed to land on their feet, despite their own transgressions. Born into a wealthy German industrial family, he had fled to Paris with a beautiful dancer and funds stolen from his father. Somehow he later became a German secret agent in Morocco, highly prized until they discovered he was also selling information to the French as well. Allegedly a bounty was put on his head, and he joined the French Foreign Legion to escape. In the Legion, you are given a different name and identity, a practice that continues today, making it an ideal way to disappear. Hope I'm not giving any ideas to anybody out there at the moment. He rose rapidly through the ranks and was much prized for his talent with languages and mapping the mountains. However, he was soon back to his old tricks, and it was discovered that he'd been defrauding his unit and stealing the cash. Deserting the Legion, he somehow talked his way into being adopted by a Riffian tribe and became a Muslim. Taking several young Riffian girls as his wives, he was soon leading attacks on his former French comrades. Often he would wear his old legionary uniform and stride into French fortifications, find their weak spots, and then he would lead his men in devastating raids against them. His legend grew, and he started pinning sheets of paper to his victims that bore his name, the German Haji, rather like the fictional Mark of Zorro. While he would join El Krim and would become a respected advisor, he was in no way the source of the Riffians' victories. The legend of German officers leading the Riffians was a way for the Spanish to explain why they were being defeated by non-white tribesmen. As the Spanish licked their wounds behind the Primo Line, El Krim was at the peak of his power and influence. It seemed as though Spain might abandon Morocco, and his Rif Republic might even be recognised by the great powers. It seemed like a time to dream of a great future. He even wrote a letter to the British Prime Minister, Ramsay MacDonald, claiming that the future of our country is unlimited. We have confidence in our industrial capacity and in our ability to distinguish ourselves in peace as well as in war. and we ask the outside world, in the name of justice, to give us that opportunity. If the world will not give us peace now, when we are ready for it, we shall fight until we have gained it by our swords and by the will of Allah. Yet hubris often comes before a fall. Maybe Abd el Krim had been too successful, his victories too complete, for he now began to make mistakes, whereas once he had cautioned his followers not to provoke the French at all costs. In his overconfidence, he would now launch an attack on the French and drag them into the war. This would be a catastrophic error and would doom him to eventual defeat. We haven't talked much about the French so far, yet they controlled the vast majority of Morocco outside of Spain's small coastal strip. As the Spanish suffered defeat after defeat, the French at first found the situation amusing. They held the Spanish army in such utter contempt that they didn't think Abd el Krim's successes were that impressive. They were of the opinion that a band of Girl Scouts could probably defeat the Spanish army. A bit unfairly, in my opinion. They offered no support to the Spanish and allowed supplies to flow through their territory to El Krim without restraint. Yet after Spain withdrew its army to the Primo line, the more perceptive of their officials began to get concerned. El Krim was becoming something of an icon to Muslims across the nations of Morocco, Algeria, and Tunisia. Pictures of himself and his army defeating the Christians had become commonplace, while articles in Arabic newspapers wrote gushingly of his triumphs. France was the dominant imperial power in all of these countries. A popular, local, anti-colonialist hero was a thorn in their side and had the potential to cause revolts against them. Marshal Hubert Lyautey, the leader of French forces in Morocco, wrote urgently to Paris that, although there is no immediate danger, nothing could be so bad for our regime as the installation near Fez, an important Moroccan holy city, of an independent Muslim state, modernized and supported by the most warlike tribes, with their morale exalted by success against the Spaniards, making Krim the center of attraction, not only to our dissidents, but to all those Moroccan elements, particularly the young, for whom recent events have broadened their horizon and raised xenophobic aspirations. Part of the Rif Mountains actually fell on the French side of Morocco, along the line they had drawn with Spain. Previously, the French had stayed out of the mountains. There was little there that interested them compared to the rest of Morocco. However, with El Krim's victories against the Spanish, they began to establish blockhouses and forts to secure the border. Increasingly, they started to have their own disagreements with the Rif Republic. Soon, an overconfident El Krim decided he could defeat the French, as well as fighting the Spanish at the same time, and he started laying plans for war. There was also a lot of arrogance on the French side that despite El Krim's victories against the Spanish, he would be no match for them. One French official boasted that, "You have seen the great Abd el Krim? These native chiefs, we know them well. They are really simple fellows. Properly handled, they respond to kindness. There is of course not the slightest chance that this one will ever attack us, or challenge the might of France." Rather like Sylvie until he faced defeat at Anual, they had grossly underestimated El Krim and his Riffians. They would pay a bitter price for this arrogance. The man who would supposedly never attack France launched his offensive on April the 12th, 1925. French posts fell one by one, just like their Spanish counterparts before them. The Riffians would surround the outposts, cutting them off from resupply, then relentlessly shell and snipe at the defenders until they were so weakened they could be overrun. Even psychological warfare came into play. The tribesmen threw the horribly mangled bodies of dead French soldiers next to the French barricades, leaving them there to rot before the defenders' eyes. Such tactics were horribly effective. Blockhouse 7 was garrisoned by 30 French soldiers and held out for 3 weeks before being overrun. The survivors were all beheaded. Another brutal siege occurred at Beni Derkul and became one of the most legendary moments of the war. 39 French soldiers garrisoned the outpost, led by a recent graduate of the military academy, Lieutenant Paul Lepierre. His diary survived the battle, and I'll be reading from it to give you a real idea of how brutal the siege was. Surrounded by the Riffians, he wrote, "We received grenades and even shells. These caused me some great losses. 3 killed, 1 wounded. This time they threw themselves on the barbed wire, and in one place they succeeded in getting past by throwing large bundles of palm leaves onto it. But the attack was suppressed. It is all one. I, who wish to see combat, am worn out. I am very tired and overworked. It would be overjoyed to see the relief come." French airplanes dropped large blocks of ice, some of which actually reached the defenders. The French seemed to be better aiming than the Spanish pilots. Famously, one of the blocks had a note attached, saying, "To our friends up there from the mechanics of the 4th, courage! We are thinking of you!" By May the 30th, Lapierre wrote that, "The pemmican and biscuits barely go around. Our destiny is sealed on the 6th if nobody comes. The 1st is fearful. Are they thinking of us in France?" Worse was to come for Lapierre's men, as the nearby fort of Biban fell on June 6th. In all, 6 major battles had occurred at Biban, which often went hand to hand, so fierce was the fighting. In the last of these, only a grenade charge by the French Foreign Legion drove the Riffians back, at a cost of 103 French dead and over 300 wounded. But French bravery could only hold out for so long. When the fort fell for the final time, the Riffians killed the entire garrison. Continuing their psychological warfare tactics, the tribesmen took dead French soldiers from Biban and put them on pikes outside of Beni Derkal. As night fell, the defenders knew their time was near. Let us join them. As you stare out into the darkness from the French barricades, you are thankful that you can now barely see the French soldiers on pikes. These Riffians think their brutality will weaken your resolve, but instead they inspire you to go down fighting. Against such an enemy, there can be no surrender. A fire flickers in its last at the foot of one of the stakes. You can see the shadows of tribesmen surrounding it. Then a voice echoes out of the dark. Surprisingly, they're speaking German. "How many of you Europeans are left in the post?" You shout back, "Balls to the lot of you." The voice laughs. "Those who the German Haji has marked for death never escape." It is too dark to take a shot at him, but you wish you could. Then Lieutenant Lapierre approaches you. "They will attack in the morning, but I have an idea that will take most of them with us. I need your knowledge of explosives." We have reached the scene we started this podcast with. When the Riffians attacked, a mine was detonated next to the ammunition store, and a huge explosion lit up the mountains. Years later, the lieutenant's diary was found, and a statue was dedicated to Lapierre at the French Military Academy. As countless French positions were overrun or abandoned, El Krim seemed on the brink of winning his greatest triumph. Fez, the great Moroccan holy city, seemed within his grasp. Rumours spread far and wide that he had pledged to capture the city before the holy festival of the Big Feast, taking over the Sultan of Morocco's traditional role in sacrificing the first sheep and declaring himself the rightful ruler of all Morocco. Panicked French authorities rushed troops to Fez. Even the Sultan of Morocco arrived to inspire citizens to resist El Karim's forces. Still, in the back of everyone's mind was the thought, would this be enough to stop the mighty army of El Karim? If El Karim had marched on Fez and had successfully captured it, he could have started a nationwide revolt against the French. Indeed, one of his sons later said that, "My father believed that if he had ordered his troops to advance, he would have taken Fez and occupied all Morocco in May 1925. Yet the expected attack never came. Why? The main problem was that while his tribal army was magnificent on the offensive, it had little experience in taking and holding cities. To try and adapt now would leave them open to French artillery and bombers. Plus, the citizens of Fez may not have welcomed him. It was the largest city in Morocco, famed for its urban culture. Many feared El Krim and his mountain men as dangerous primitives, and quietly backed the French attempts to save their city. They had the same attitude as Londoners might have to being threatened by Scottish Highlanders, or New York by Appalachian mountain folk. Though El Krim had certainly dented French pride and killed thousands of its soldiers, he had not inflicted a catastrophic defeat. French lines stabilised, and they even began to recapture territory by September. The full might of France would now be mobilised against El Krim. They would even bury the hatchet and ally with Spain to take down his Rif Republic. El Krim would fight on, but now he was surrounded by enemies, cut off from his supply routes, and facing two determined opponents. It was no longer a matter of if, but when he would be defeated. As the Riffians were distracted by their new war with France, Spain began to attack them with a new weapon. Previously, modern weaponry such as armoured cars had failed to produce results in the mountains. But now Spain deployed something that was far more lethal and effective. In the name of bringing European civilization to the Riffians, Spain deployed poison gas on a scale not seen since the First World War. General Berenguer, Sylvie's old boss, summed up the new mood among Spain's military leadership. I have been obstinately resistant to the use of suffocating gases against these indigenous peoples, but after what they have done, and of their treacherous and deceptive conduct, I have to use them with true joy. The aim of Spanish pilots had not improved, while the use of such weapons against small groups of tribesmen in the mountains would not have been efficient. Instead, bombs filled with mustard gas and phosgene were dropped on civilian villages in a sustained campaign to terrorize the tribes into submission. At the height of the terror campaign, 127 bombers were dropping around 1,680 bombs filled with poison gas every day. El Krim had no way to defend against these attacks, and they would play a major role in his defeat. The League of Nations and international treaties had banned the use of poison gas after the revulsion against its use in the Great War. However, it only applied to wars between civilized nations, not in civil wars or when fighting colonial subjects. Not until well after the Second World War would this loophole be closed, mainly due to opposition from nations with large empires. Britain, France, and America, I'm looking at you here. Interestingly, Spain got their chemical weapons from Germany. While the Treaty of Versailles banned them from making or selling such weapons, they were secretly still doing so, and the large Spanish orders allowed them to keep this part of their war machine ticking over. When the Civil War came to Spain, the German contacts the Spanish military had made during this time were very helpful in getting Nazi support. France was not much better. While not using poison gas, they were also heavily bombing civilian villages in the Rif. A particularly infamous unit of airmen came to the fore and would cause an international incident before they were done. Imagine this in your mind's eye. You are a soldier in the French Foreign Legion, watching a remarkable aerial display. The pilots of this unit pull off some amazing stunts to entertain the troops below, a break from their relentless bombing runs against the tribesmen who so deviously attacked the French. One thing confuses you though. The planes do not have French markings. Instead, all they have is an image of a bison on the Great Plains, painted on their sides. You asked your officer about these mysterious planes. He smiled, somewhat slyly, and just said they're attached to the Sultan of Morocco's forces. They're nothing to do with France. You have been in Morocco long enough to know that the Sultan doesn't take a dump without France's approval. It only increased your curiosity. Now, you are guarding this base, you can finally meet the airmen who have saved your life on multiple occasions. When the planes land, you cross the airfield and greet one of the pilots. He replies in perfect French, but to your surprise, with a strong American accent. "Bonjour. The name's Sweeney. Charles Sweeney." These mysterious airmen helping the French were all American pilots, recruited by a veteran of the First World War, Colonel Charles Sweeney. Sweeney was one of those who enjoyed the excitement of the war and disliked peacetime. He lived a fascinating life, somehow participating in virtually every conflict in the interwar period, as a spy, mercenary flyer, journalist, and sometimes as all three at the same time. In the future, I'll have to do a short bonus episode on him. He was present at so many historic moments. His participation in the Rif War, however, is a major black spot on his record. The volunteer American squadron he recruited technically worked for the Sultan of Morocco. However, in reality, they were under the command of the French. They ruthlessly bombed civilian villages, one time even hitting a village that had previously surrendered. While the majority of the volunteers seemed to just want an exciting life in the dull years of peace, Sweeney himself claimed that, "In our view, France, in fighting Abd el Krim, is fighting the cause of the white man's civilization, and all who have formed this squadron know enough of the world to appreciate what the white man's civilization means." I think it's safe to say that Sweeney certainly wasn't woke. Even at the time, his views and actions provoked outrage. In America, El Krim was seen as something of a hero, and the American squadron was condemned for its targeting of Rif villages when their presence was revealed. The pressure from the US government to close down the unit became intense after a media campaign against them, and after 6 weeks the American squadron was disbanded. But in those 6 weeks of operations, they had carried out 350 combat missions and dropped more than 40 tons of bombs. Viva la Muerte indeed. The Rif seemed to attract those who loved war and death. El Krim and his tribesmen fought on valiantly, but with the French advancing from the south, and the Rifians' villages constantly being bombed, his people were getting worn down by the conflict. Then, Spain struck what would be the fatal blow to his Rif Republic. El Krim had always enjoyed success after success against the Spanish, so much so that he now had nothing but contempt for them. However, this blinded him to the changes happening to the Spanish army while they waited behind the Primo line. Major reforms had been launched by Primo. The dead wood among the officer corps had been cleared out. Training of Spanish soldiers was vastly improved, while the army as a whole had become much more professional and organised. It was no longer the same force that had been completely humiliated at Anual. It even had a bold new strategy to take the war to El Krim's key stronghold at Al-Uhimas Bay. Roughly right in the middle of Spain's North Moroccan protectorate, every attempt to reach here by land had always led to failure and disaster. However, this new attack would come from the sea. A flotilla of 100 ships landed at Cabadilla Beach, just west of the bay, on September the 8th, 1925. This was not the same army that Sylvie had led. It was Primo's army. 88 land-based aircraft and 12 seaplanes pounded the nearby Rif villages and defences. 30 warships pounded the coastline with their guns, while dozens of landing craft put 8,000 Spanish troops onto the beaches. These were not the poorly trained conscripts of before. They were mostly tercio and regulars units who were well supplied, well armed, well motivated, and well trained. Naval landings are often extremely costly failures. One only has to look at Gallipoli in the First World War. This one, however, went like clockwork. Fun fact, it was so well organised that General Ike Eisenhower would read up on it and use the operation as example to help plan D-Day. Surprised by where the Spaniards had landed and the sheer scale of the offensive, El Krim desperately tried to fight back. He counter-attacked repeatedly, trying to drive the Spanish from the beaches, but their firepower was too much. As the Spanish began fighting their way inland toward his capital of Agadir, the tercios and regulars took 15 days just to advance 2 miles. However, on October the 2nd, Agadir was finally overrun. As Abd el Krim was pushed deeper into the Rif Mountains, the final great battle took place. It was a true bloodbath, and 1,000 Spaniards died before it was done. But they took over 1,000 Rifians with them. These were the cream of Abd el Krim's army, and it broke the back of the rebellion. Knowing he would be executed by the Spanish, Abd el Krim surrendered to the French instead. He was given a comfortable exile on the French-owned island of Réunion in the Indian Ocean. The French didn't want to create a martyr. Instead, they wanted the Rifians to slowly forget all about Abd el Krim. After some mopping-up operations, the Spanish recaptured Anual. There, they stood bareheaded in the dust and rubble, remembering their comrades who'd been slaughtered back in 1921. They had been avenged. The war was finally over. To celebrate Spain's great victory, the king created a royal medal for the Moroccan campaign. Its inscription was, "Spain, always disposed to every enterprise of universal civilization, contributed to that of Morocco with the precious blood of her sons and the gold of her coffers. The triumph of her arms and the culture of her methods are the foundation of this great work of humanity." Has there ever been a medal that was a bigger lie? The war was over. The Rif had been pacified. The Rifians had lost 30,000 casualties and had seen their homeland virtually destroyed. But it had been a horrific cost for Spain. 50,000 Spanish troops had been killed and wounded. They had suffered the most humiliating defeat ever inflicted on a European colonial power, and the war had undermined Spanish democracy and brought the military to power. To win, it had resorted to barbaric methods such as poison gas. And in the end, it was Abd el Krim's error of attacking the French that was the true turning point of the war. Spain had gained little for all this sacrifice. The poor and devastated Rif could provide little of any benefit. In fact, the Rif War would become a curse that would soon devastate the mainland itself. The Spanish army, and especially the officers and elite units who had fought in it, had been hardened, radicalized, and were disaffected from Madrid. While Primo could keep them in line, when his dictatorship fell, the republic that replaced it struggled to deal with them, and the road to the Civil War began. If you look at the Spanish officer corps on the brink of the Civil War, it was those who served in the Rif who would support the revolt. Those who hadn't would back the Republic instead. The divide is amazingly stark. As Spain was consumed by civil war, the brutal tactics used in the Rif were transported to the mainland. It was the tercios and the regulars, along with foreign help, that would enable the triumph of the military and the rise of the Franco dictatorship. As for Abd el Krim, his exile to Réunion wasn't the end of his story. In 1947, on health grounds, he was given permission to move to the south of France. During the journey, he was rescued by Moroccan nationalists from his French jailers and smuggled to Egypt, where he would spend the rest of his life. He died in 1963, having seen Algeria, Tunisia, and Morocco all gain their independence from France and Spain. As for the Rifians today, they are the best soldiers in the Moroccan army, if not in all of North Africa. For our next conflict, we'll be leaving the Rif Mountains and heading to the coasts of China for the First Opium War. Through the fumes of opium smoke, we will see how devious opium merchants, frustrated British envoys, and mandarins fearful of the decay of the Chinese state collided in a conflict that would change the world forever. I've recently been in contact with another new podcaster, Skylar, at the Weekly Dive podcast. A cool guy covering some interesting subjects. Here is a promo for his podcast.
Hey everyone, my name is Skylar Taylor, and I'm the host of The Weekly Dive. a podcast all about niche stories, mysterious events, and adventurous lives throughout history, culture, and travel. Unlike other podcasts, I'm not a historian or journalist. I'm just a college student learning about topics that strike my interest. Join me each week, and together we will experience the funniest and jaw-dropping stories left in the shadows. If you want to learn about massive whiskey floods, Napoleon's battle against bunnies, or a bear that fought in World War II, then check out The Weekly Dive on Spotify or Apple Podcasts. Thank you all, and I'll see you soon.
Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed the podcast, please like, subscribe, leave a comment, or tell a friend. See you next time for more Forgotten Wars.